Well, Richard Heydarian is an assistant professor of political science at De La Salle University, but he joins us live now from the ASEAN Media Centre in Manila. Richard, great to talk to you this evening. North Korea, of course, dominating discussions at this ASEAN summit. Interestingly enough, North Korea has just issued this communique, which is, I'd imagine, quite unusual. Tell us what you make of this communique.
Well, as you correctly said, there are actually two issues that dominated the discussion. One is North Korea. The other one was the South China Sea issue. On South China Sea issue, there were some divisions within the ASEAN itself. So the communique really reflects that kind of internal divisions. But on North Korea, it seems there was almost a consensus, of course, with the notable exception of the North Korean foreign minister, who was also in attendance and met his Chinese counterpart, Foreign Minister Wang Yi. The ASEAN in its communique expressed grave concern about the behavior of North Korea, especially North Korea's decision to test an intercontinental ballistic missile last month in July, and of course North Korea's burgeoning capability, missile capability and nuclear capability that could also put the American mainland within its scope within the coming years. So I think there was extreme amount of sense of urgency on the part of even ASEAN countries, and I think that's where Rex Tillerson was able to get some support from the regional states. Even the Chinese seem to have ratcheted up their pressure on North Korea. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, chastised the North Koreans against provoking the international community. So the North Koreans are very isolated in this meeting, and no wonder they lashed back to their state-sponsored newspaper.
Indeed. And of course, they are very angry about the UN sanctions, which was unprecedented with this 45-0 sort of endorsement. They, though, still see they have this right to be nuclear armed, and they are warning the United States, of course, of sort of grave retaliation. They seem impervious to this pressure.
Well, definitely, I'm sure the North Koreans will always try to put a tough front. This feeds their domestic narrative that they're against imperialists from outside. But I think one thing that we have to watch out is what will China do. So we saw both China and Russia going along with these new rounds of sanctions, the most punitive sanctions ever. But of course, as the United States made it clear, the challenge forward is to make sure that there's full support by all countries involved to actually enforce those sanctions. So a number of ASEAN countries actually in the past had very close relationship with North Korea. North Koreans have some visa-free access to several Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia, for instance. And then, of course, China is the conduit for more than 70% of financial transaction that goes into North Korea. So the United States really tried to bring ASEAN countries and China together to ratchet up tensions and to really squeeze the North Koreans until the regime will relent. I think, Secretary Tillerson made it very clear that we don't want war here. Trump may say something else, but as far as the diplomats here were concerned, everyone is saying we want dialogue. But as long as North Korea doesn't change its behavior, we're going to tighten the noose on you.
Let's talk South China Sea, because China is there at the summit, sort of breathing down the neck of many ASEAN nations who feel the pressure of the military build-up in the South China Sea. Did this communique go far enough in terms of letting China know that this is not wanted?
Well, something very interesting happened. So Vietnam, which controls the most number of land features in the Spratly chain of islands, where China is building its massive islands, artificial islands, and deploying military assets, the Vietnamese quite openly came out and said the ASEAN should take the fight to China and to criticize China on that issue. So there were very heated discussions. Cambodia repeatedly, Cambodia is, of course, close to China, repeatedly tried to block efforts by Vietnam to push for a strong language against China. So eventually what happened is that the Philippines, as the chairman, came up with a compromise. So if you look at the communique, what it says is that the ASEAN takes note of certain concerns raised by some member countries. So in short, the communique reflects the concerns of Vietnam and to a lesser degree Malaysia and other countries, but it says that there's no consensus on that issue. There was a mention of militarization of the disputes, but there was no direct criticism of China. So it's an improvement from the April statement when Duterte released a chairman's statement, which absolutely had nothing critical of China. So this is quite an improvement because of Vietnam's very strong effort and lobby. But nothing major was mentioned. The Philippines arbitration award was not mentioned there. There was no word called serious concern, which usually ASEAN uses to criticize China quite implicitly. The word legally binding code of conduct was also not there. So I think it was a slam dunk diplomatic victory for China. China was definitely dominating these meetings.
And of course, some argue that that's happening because the US is not strong enough given the sort of chaos of the Trump administration back home domestically. Was Rex Tillerson's presence there calming in any way?
Well, I mean, let's be honest. It's a combination of Trump and Duterte, right? Because Duterte has also kind of pivoted away from U.S. and become closer to China. And Duterte made it very clear that he doesn't want to confront China on the South China Sea issue, and he's not going to use the Philippine chairmanship for that. So on one hand, you have the Philippines actually lurching towards China. And then, of course, as far as Rex Tillerson is concerned, I mean, there are already rumors that he's on the way out. You know, Rexit is one of the words that we hear in recent days because Secretary Tillerson seems to be struggling to really have an imprint, consequential imprint on Trump's policy in Asia. And you had many instances, including the Qatar crisis, for instance, in the Gulf, whereby, Tillerson calls for something, Donald Trump in his Twitter completely says another thing. So to be honest, I think here in ASEAN, we're more looking at what Secretary James Mattis says rather than Rex Tillerson's, because we know that the Pentagon has more influence. The generals have more influence on Trump. So unfortunately, I think Rex Tillerson was not able to, make as much impression as he could. But at least on the issue of North Korea, he was able to rally regional support to the maximum possibility.
Fascinating stuff, Richard. As always, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.